Hello, everyone. I'm your professor, and this is ANTH A490C, Anthropology of Religion and the Supernatural. Not as in the amazing CW TV show Supernatural, which is one of the greatest TV shows of all time, but instead as in more generally, sort of how cultures approach the supernatural. Now, before we get started, I want to make one very, very critical point before we start this lecture, or before we start this class, which is about how we're using the term religion or religious. And it may be very different from how you're used to using the term in everyday conversation. So as an example, where I used to live in Texas, it was a high percentage of Christians. And I remember one time seeing a bumper sticker that said, "It's not a religion, it's a relationship." I think I may have seen it more than once, actually. You may have also heard people say the idea spiritual but not religious. And in fact, the group of people in the US who identify as spiritual but not religious has grown rather remarkably over the last few years to about 27%. And so there's this distinction we sometimes draw in how we talk about religion in the United States between religious and spiritual. And when you kind of drill down into what people mean by that, at least part of what people are talking about is the concept of like an organized religion, right? So religion with sort of a formal membership, perhaps formal leadership, things like that. Sometimes it has to do with the idea of sort of inward versus outward behavior. I completely respect that that's how we use those words in everyday conversation, but as with many fields of study, that term has a more technical meaning in anthropology than the way we use it in everyday conversation, right? So for just like, people use the term organic one way when they're talking about food at the grocery store, and organic in a very different way if they're in an organic chemistry class, right? So it's the same way here. The term religion for our purposes is much broader in an anthropology class. It encompasses folks that identify as spiritual and spiritual practices that are not affiliated with an organized religion. Another way I want to distinguish what we mean by religion is pointing out that it also encompasses things such as magical systems of practice. It is not uncommon for people to not treat magic and religion as the same thing. Indeed, anthropologists are sometimes the worst offenders in this regard. In fact, the chapter I had you read this week from Stein and Stein comes from their pretty well-known textbook that I used to use for this class, The Anthropology of Religion, Magic, and Witchcraft. And partly because of some work done by anthropologists in the 1800s and early 1900s, anthropologists for a long time kind of used those terms as related but separate terms, religion and magic, often with the idea that sort of magic seeks to compel the supernatural, while religion seeks to appeal to or pray to the supernatural. The problem with such an easy distinction is that it often falls apart when you actually look at actual societies, not just sort of do armchair anthropology, as they say. In many cases, what we were labeling as magic, in fact, involves all sorts of prayers to deities, and the idea that this may or may not happen depending on how the deity or the spirits feel about it. And conversely, a religion certainly sometimes involves things that are thought to almost compel the divine. And so nowadays, we think of magic more as a subset of religion, as a specific kind of religious practice, one that involves, among other things, the use of symbolic means and ritual means to bring about specific ends. So religion then, as we're using it in anthropology, is a much, much bigger term, right? So I'm defining it here just for simplicity and brevity as any sort of approach to the supernatural, which involves both belief and practice. And so, for example, the Hand of Fatima, which you see here on the left, that is an amulet that you will see often, you'll see it in the United States as well, but you see it a lot in places like various parts of Northern Africa and the Middle East and the Mediterranean world. And it often is an amulet people will wear on their neck or that they'll have up in a window. And the idea is that it protects one from the evil eye, which is a sort of a bad effect somebody can have by looking at you or looking at a family member of you with jealousy. So, in fact, there are sort of practices that have arisen around that. For example, in Mexico, sometimes people will like touch a baby that's really cute to kind of like ward off the evil eye, because the idea is that somebody might have the evil eye and get jealous, right? And affect the baby with oho, or with eye, evil eye. So Hand of Fatima then is not exactly an organized religion, right? There's no, to my knowledge, Church of the Hand of Fatima or something like that. Instead, it's a widespread practice that people do, that at least some people, and I think a lot of people, take very seriously as a way of sort of supernatural protection. The way we use the term religion in anthropology, that is religion. It is an approach to the supernatural that involves a certain kind of practice and a certain kind of belief attached to that practice. Similarly, when I did fieldwork on the Navajo Nation, which is where I did a lot of my early research as an anthropologist, I was interviewing people about topics of sacred mountains and views of the sacred mountain and what makes a sacred mountain affected negatively, but in my case by a ski resort. And as I would talk to people about these ideas, I had more than one person, several people actually, say something along the lines of, it's not a religion, it's a way of life, or it's a way of thought. And I completely understand what those folks are talking about too, right? Because, for example, one of the ways that people would explain that is they'd say, religion's something you do on Sunday. This is something you do all the time, right? So I certainly get what they're saying, kind of this embodied practice that's not confined to certain occasions, but instead just sort of happens all the time, not necessarily in formal situations, sometimes in formal situations. From an anthropology perspective, though, we would call that religion, because we're using the term to mean an approach to the supernatural. And within traditional Dene Hatali or medicine people practices, you have things like sand paintings that are done as part of multi-day sings or healing ceremonies that are done for people that have become afflicted, among other things, because of an imbalance or having done something against or been negatively affected by some kind of infraction with the rest of the natural and cosmic world. So from an anthropological perspective, we would say definitely religion, although from sort of an everyday English perspective, people might describe it differently. And finally, something like tarot cards. If somebody, I know there are sometimes practitioners of tarot who do not interpret them as sort of literally divining the future. However, some people do that use tarot. And from that point of view, if you're using tarot cards to divine the future, right, that's supernatural. That's not something that your average everyday person can do. And so we would consider that religion. What we would not, now you might be saying, well, what doesn't count as religion then? Let me give you a good example. A very, very large percentage of Americans believe in ghosts. Believing in ghosts can be connected to religion. So for example, if you believe in spirits because of a certain view of the afterlife, however, if you just sort of have a generic belief in ghosts and don't normally believe in like an afterlife or something, and it's just kind of its own thing, and you don't really do any actions towards the ghost and it doesn't really affect your life in any way, would that be religion? It's borderline. It's probably not what we usually mean. You could make the case, but it's probably not what we usually mean. So there's kind of blurry lines there, right? All right, so point being, we're using religion broadly. Now I'm going to stop the video there and we'll keep going in just a second.